Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm your co-host for today's show, in which we will unpack the complexities of digital authoritarianism. In order to do so, we have convened some of the brightest minds in Africa and globally who are working on these important issues. We will ask what can be done to push back against the expansion of digital surveillance and figure out how we can protect citizens' human rights from regimes determined to hack into our lives and monitor the moves of critics, dissidents, and those perceived to pose a threat to the political establishment. Thankfully, helping me to guide today's conversation is my colleague, Mentate Mloshwa. Hey, Mentate, how are you feeling today?
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good, good. How are you? Glad to have you with us, as always. And as a way of refreshing everyone's memory, the Resistance Bureau focuses on the major threats to human rights in Africa and worldwide, while shining a light on the enduring struggles for freedom. This program features the leaders at the forefront of these critical fights, and we seek to build solidarity and networks among them. It is in this spirit that we are joined by today's stellar panel, which our viewers will notice has changed a bit in the last few hours, so thanks to everyone for bearing with us and for tuning in. First, we have with us Sienna Anstis. She is an expert who specializes in human rights and technology. Highly relevant to today's topic, her research area focuses on the impact of digital transnational repression on immigrant and refugee communities. Currently, she serves as a senior legal advisor at Citizen Lab, an innovative research facility where she works at the intersection of cyberspace, security, and human rights. We're also joined by Placide Kayumba, a Rwandan human rights activist and member of the political opposition in exile. Placide is among the hundreds of known individuals worldwide who have been targeted with the Israeli-made Pegasus spyware, of which the Rwandan regime is an alleged client. His insights will bring home the personal impact of the issues we will be discussing today. Next, we have Ridwan Oluyede from Nigeria. Ridwan is a legal practitioner and an expert in the areas of data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, and digital ethics. He is a co-founder of Tech Hive Advisory and was a co-author on a recent research paper, certainly germane to today's discussion, that analyzed surveillance laws across several African states. Our discussant today, who will be joining us a bit later on, is Albert Shara, an academic and prize-winning journalist who is wrapping up his PhD studies at the University of Edinburgh. Albert is conducting research on state repression in digital spaces and investigating how protest actions are both regulated and repressed. So thanks to Albert for joining us, especially on short notice. Also later on, we'll hopefully hear insights from Julie Owono. She is the executive director of Internet Without Borders, a worldwide network of NGOs that works to defend fundamental freedoms and fight back against online censorship. For our listeners, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Resist Bureau and use the hashtag ResistBureauLive for today's show. Right now, we are live streaming on Facebook and on YouTube, so thanks for joining us again, as well as recording the show for later distribution. Before we turn to today's panel, I will now cede to my co-host Mentate so that she can set the scene for us. Mentate, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. While digital technology has brought opportunities and freedoms and the power to destabilize dictators, the increasing surveillance, internet shutdowns, and disinformation, among other control measures, have also enabled repression. Democratic governance is built on the provision and respect for the right to expression and association, access to information, and the right to privacy. These rights, by extension, empower citizens to participate in civic and political processes that, in turn, translate to accountable leadership. Authoritarians across the continent, on the other hand, have used technology to their collective advantage, censoring online activity and critical voices, hacking into the accounts of journalists and pro-democracy leaders, and switching off the internet with impunity. A June 2020 report by the Collaboration on International ICT Policy in East and Southern Africa highlights some of those critical control measures that we must reflect upon as we transition to our panel discussion today.
Nick, it looks like we've lost Mentate for a bit. Did you want to step in and finish the introduction here, or did you want me to do that?
Hey everyone, sadly it looks like we've lost Mentate for a second. I think we're basically at the end of the introduction there. So perhaps it's a good moment that we move to our first set of questions, Jeff.
Sure thing. Hopefully we get that figured out. But before we get into our panel, I'd just like to say that, of course, we'll be discussing today the transnational nature of digital repression and authoritarianism, and that really it demands an international response and solidarity, and that is the foundation for today's show. And as for the audience, you can share your own reflections through our YouTube channel, on Twitter, and on Facebook, in our comment sections. And please do send us your questions via WhatsApp on the number +263 77 623 8199. If you didn't catch that, it should be on the screen now, but you can also access it on our website and, of course, on our social media channels. So, Sienna, to set the stage, we'd really like to come to you first. And we really have a simple but rather broad question that will hopefully, set the stage for us moving forward. And we're coming to you first because we know that you've been deeply involved in researching digital authoritarianism and, of course, bringing awareness to this issue as part of your work at Citizen Lab. So, what does this concept mean in theory and in practice? And how would you explain it to an audience, perhaps those listening today that might not be familiar with the term and its real-world implications?
Hey everybody, thanks for the invite to be here. Very happy to be here on such an interesting panel and with such interesting colleagues. So I'll try and sort of set the stage in a very general way, and then I think Placide in particular and others will have some perhaps more intimate, more interesting things to say about digital authoritarianism. So just to start with a simple definition of digital authoritarianism. So this concept happens when governments use information and communication technologies to control their citizens, such as by using it to track and stifle different forms of dissent, to put it very simply. So the spread of internet connectivity was originally thought of, I think, in quite positive terms. Social media platforms, for example, provided new and exciting avenues to have discussions regarding one's government in particular, in what felt like relative safety versus taking to the streets. The fact that discussions could happen at scale in multiple digital places and on privately owned platforms made state control much more difficult. It also provided digital spaces to organize in a far-reaching and ostensibly safer and more efficient way. At the same time, of course, as digital repression techniques took hold and governments began to harness information and communication technologies as a mechanism of repression, these same tools became avenues for governments to surveil, threaten, and persecute dissidents and activists, which I think we'll hear a lot more about today. So you did ask about theory, so I apologize in advance, but perhaps a helpful way of thinking through the progression of digital repression is to think about Ron Debert's 3 generations of information control framework. So the first generation of information controls were those of a primarily defensive nature. So think about the Great Firewall of China, so intended to limit citizens' access to information abroad. Second generation controls extended those information controls into society through the enactment of regulation, laws, or requirements that really forced the private sector to do what the authoritarian government wanted when it came to control over information and communication technologies and how they interact with society. So examples of this are new and expanded wiretapping and surveillance laws, passing cybercrime laws to constrain online behavior at home, or the implementation of internet censorship and filtering systems. Now, third generation controls really move from defensive to offensive. So this encompasses campaigns of targeted digital espionage and surveillance. It involves the recruitment and development of systems of online harassment, disinformation, and surveillance on social media platforms, such as through the creation of electronic armies, whose purpose it is to discredit and silence dissent wherever it comes from. And it also, I think this will come up today as well, encompasses, for example, the use of NSO Group's Pegasus spyware or other forms of spyware to engage in targeted surveillance of dissidents. So in short, digital authoritarianism involves governments leveraging and deploying information and communication technologies to control their citizens. And the early days of online platforms being used as successful tools for activists to organize and communicate has really shifted towards a situation that's much more complex, where governments are also exploiting the availability of these online networks to control dissent. And governments implement digital repression through various techniques, including surveillance, censorship, social manipulation, disinformation, internet shutdowns, and persecutions against online users, just to draw in the categories that are identified in Stephen Feldstein's recent book on digital repression. So with that said, I'll close with a few words about our research at the Citizen Lab. So over the past few years, I, along with my colleagues, have been working in particular on the proliferation of spyware used in the targeted surveillance of civil society, human rights defenders, and journalists, among others. And I think it's safe to say that what we are seeing is an alarming trend in states' ability to access and deploy these technologies against whoever they wish to target, and in flagrant disregard for international human rights law, and in many cases, domestic law as well. And the rise of the mercenary spyware industry, which is the private sector that preys on the fact that our mobile phones go everywhere with us, is making it easier and easier for governments around the world to access highly invasive technology that essentially hands over the entire contents of our phones to the state. And just to be clear, this isn't just a trend happening in authoritarian regimes, but I think it's safe to say that most countries are seeing new opportunities in terms of social control through the adoption of new forms of surveillance technology. I mean, spyware to facial recognition software to other forms of surveillance technology. And we're also seeing what we call, which I think Jeff mentioned at the beginning, this spread of digital transnational oppression. So the targeting of dissidents and activists who are now living abroad outside their countries of origin, who thought themselves to be in relative safety and are now being targeted online as well as in person. This further shrinks the available space in which to engage in dissent online. And so this trend in the proliferation of spyware forms part of a larger picture, as I've described, of governments using the internet and information and communication technologies to control their citizens. It also requires, as does all forms of information control, a robust response in law and policy, both at the domestic level and at the international level. So when it comes to spyware going forward, many suggestions have been made in order to address the issue of proliferation. So at the forefront is the need for a moratorium on the sale, export, and transfer and use of these tools until there is a human rights compliant safeguard regime in place. And there's opportunity for public debate about how these technologies are going to be used, if at all. We need to ensure as well robust export and import frameworks and establish mechanisms for ensuring that targets are able to access effective remedies. Private companies that work in the surveillance space, whether it's spyware or other surveillance technologies, need to be subject to mandatory human rights due diligence. Government surveillance needs to happen when it happens under a legal framework that ensures compliance with international rights law and standards. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think there are some basic principles that, just to close, that we urgently need to see implemented by states and prioritized at the international level. For example, transparency regarding states' purchase and use of surveillance technology. The public generally has no idea what's going on until it's way too late. There needs to be public debate prior to the adoption and use of these technologies, and strict oversight and mechanisms of accountability, just to highlight some very sort of broad principles. And so I think I'll leave it at that. And thanks again for the opportunity to join this discussion.
Of course, thank you so much. And I'm really glad you mentioned the recent book written by our friend Steve Feldstein. We actually had a video from him that we posted on our Twitter feeds and on our Facebook channel that I urge everyone to look out, in which he sort of lays out very succinctly the key elements that allow for significant control over populations. He mentions surveillance as being one, but mentions a number of tools, but also makes the key linkage that these tools are always tied to a political objective. And to follow up on that really quickly, Sienna, just to pull on one of the threads you brought up, and you mentioned this issue of transnational repression, and you mentioned online this can take the form of trolling, of disinformation, of smear campaigns, mainly directed against activists or government critics. So if you could just really briefly tell us about this expansion, or this extension rather, of digital authoritarianism to transnational spaces. What has your research at Citizen Lab, for example, found? And if you could, what countries, particularly in Africa, given our audience listening today, who have you identified as the biggest offenders in this area?
Yeah, sure. So at the Citizen Lab, we decided to sort of dig into this issue of digital transnational oppression after the targeting of Omar Abdulaziz, a Saudi dissident based in Montreal, who was targeted with NSO group spyware. So we were really interested in understanding how dissidents and activists living in Canada were being impacted by digital transnational oppression. So we conducted a series of interviews, and I think the main sort of takeaway was there's a variety of methods being used, those you just identified essentially, and that this practice is having a significant impact on targets. So it has significant psychological and social impacts that need to be addressed. It's an effective way of making people, of leading people to fear engaging online, to fear working with transnational networks, which are obviously key to ensuring to pushing stronger human rights protections and to engaging in dissent, right? So these are individuals who are in countries that are supposed to be safe, so they should be in a position of being able to speak more freely and more strongly about what's happening in their countries of origin. But as we saw, digital transnational repression is really making that much more complicated. And in terms of countries that are engaging in this, it's just quite a widespread phenomenon, which I think maps what Steve's been said in his book. In terms of African countries, I think we had some interesting examples from Ethiopia, targeting of journalists in the US, for example, and Rwanda as well, which I think might be a good segue to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Sienna. I think you did a very great introduction, and I think in a lot of the submissions that you gave, you provided also some of the ways in which we can counter the challenges that we're seeing. So what I'll do is I'll just bring Blessed into the conversation. So Kayumba, I'd like to bring you in here because we've heard quite a bit from just Sienna's introduction about the ways in which mainly authoritarian regimes have used technology to stifle free speech and human rights, as well as to intimidate people that criticize government or speak truth to power. You've experienced this firsthand. For example, we know that your phone was among those hacked using the Pegasus spyware. So we'd love for you to come in here and tell us your story. What happened to you?
Yes, thank you very much. And Sienna has said everything, because I think you are doing a great job in your research. Because actually what happened was has several impacts. We cannot measure which aspects are impacted. First of all, when I received the message from WhatsApp saying that my phone was targeted, I really was like, it's not believable. It's not possible. But I also knew that the Rwanda regime could use any means to monitor opponents and activists. Then what was very difficult for me was to realize that even my simple life at home with my children, with my wife, was monitored. I couldn't take a picture being in a normal way. As I want to take a picture, I have to think twice. Will this picture end up in Kigali within the spying services? I don't know. So that was very difficult. The second difficulty I had was that I was in contact with people in Rwanda. So my first fear was that our conversation will be used against them. And during that year, we lost 2 members of our political party. They were killed, and the third one disappeared. So that I cannot say that it was linked to the spy, the Pegasus spy, but it could be. It could be. So for me, it's also my fault that those people were killed. But that was my thought at that time. But afterwards, we had also some other people killed and disappeared. And the thing I realized is that we don't have to feel responsible for what is happening. We are victims. We are not the responsible people. So we don't have to hide. Those who are spying people in order to kill them or to avoid that they do their job, their activism, they are the one who have to hide because of shame, because of injustice. So we have to work together so that those people are the responsible for what they are doing. So the impact of the Pegasus spyware on my private life was very hard, I must say, because it changed the way I lived. I couldn't, for example, go to Africa as I used to. Every year I used to go to Africa to visit one or another country. But today I have to think twice because I know that I'm monitored. They can catch me everywhere. And I know that they kill people outside of Rwanda. We had some people killed in Kenya, in Nairobi. For example, Seth Sendashonga, a former minister, was killed there. We have people that have been killed in South Africa. In other places, like in Cameroon also, we had some people killed there. So and today in Mozambique, in last year, I think in 2021, an activist was killed in Mozambique, and you must know that some Kigali sent military contingents, you say in English, in Mozambique to fight the rebels in the north of Mozambique. So from there, they are killing people in the capital of Mozambique. So I am aware that in Africa, I'm not it's not safe for me. And also the communication I have with my family, I have to say little things because I know that they know where my children are going to school. And that is also a way to threaten me to stop what I'm doing in activism, as political opponent. So it changed my life. But progressively, I think we have to be as we work in transparent way, we don't have to hide. They have to hide. But for that, we need tools. We need researches so that any case could be public, and the public opinion is the right judge. I think it's a great support. When I had some articles in Financial Times, The Guardian, it was a great support to me and to other people in my life. That realized that, okay, they are doing wrong things, but the public opinion is judging them. That is somehow a protection for us. But as Sienna put it, they are transnationally committing crimes, so it stays a danger for activists in Rwanda and activists even abroad, but against the Rwanda regime. And I apologize for my English. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seed. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say thank you so much for just sharing your story and just putting, a human face to it, and all of those people that also were victims. I think it's something that you mentioned when you say that we shouldn't take the blame for those people that were killed or those that disappeared and things like that, because we are actually victims. And I think the other thing as well is this idea that we are constantly having to find ways in which we should or we could be safe, which should not be the way. The environment should facilitate for us to be safe while also just speaking our truth and being able to participate. So I was going to ask you a follow-up question, which is basically based on a lot of the things that you mentioned, because the fear of surveillance forces a lot of journalists, activists, and even ordinary citizens, like you say, to limit their participation in political life. There are people that have removed their online profiles, some people that share less, like you mentioned, that you actually communicate less or you limit what you share than the communication you have with the family. But we also have others who are constantly on the lookout for tools that could potentially make them safe, disappearing messages, VPNs, and all those other things. So it's just this idea that all of the things force people like you to considerably alter their lives to suit the reality that they're facing. So I wanted to ask you what advice you have for someone perhaps that's listening today who's facing a similar situation right now.
Yeah, it's very difficult, but the principle is that they don't have to feel guilty or to take the responsibility of those who are spying. They should focus on their job. If we are targeted, is that the reason why we are targeted is that we are doing a good job. If you are not targeted, you should ask yourself if your work is really a threat for those dictators and others. Sorry for saying that. But the advice I can tell to other activists is that don't try to change your right. Focus on your work. And okay, tools may help, but the important thing is to be aware that we are resisting a criminal regime, and you are resisting criminals. So even without technology or others, you will be targeted. So please keep on doing your job. You may face consequences, but I think you are aware before going further in your activism. You were aware of that, and they will not stop. But what we should do all together is to advocate for human rights and for those evolution of new technologies, so that it could be more positive for us, for the humanity, than for dictators and other criminals. And to do that, we have to work together. We should share how to say it, we should share the techniques that are used by the criminals, by the governments targeting people. We should share the opportunities to speak out, to be advocate on what we are experiencing. So work together and focus on activism. Don't fear, because that is what they want you to. They want you to fear them and to stop communicating. Don't do that. Please communicate. Don't stop. Go on. Yes, that is my advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Placide, for that very profoundly personal testimony. We really appreciate that. And I just noticed we've gotten a lot of questions about some of the books that were mentioned on the show today. And Sienna, feel free to jump in if I get this wrong, but I think the two main ones that we discussed so far that people seem to be asking about, the first one is, of course, the book we mentioned by Stephen Feldstein, who's at the Carnegie Endowment, and that's called The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. And the second book, I believe, is by Ronald Dibert from Citizen Lab, actually, and it's called Access Control: The Shaping of Power, Rights, and Rule in Cyberspace. Sienna, did I get that right?
Yeah, and he wrote it with a number of other colleagues, just to be clear.
Perfect. Perfect. So people who are interested in this topic more, definitely check out those books. They come very highly recommended. And of course, we're talking about those issues here today, and it's a good transition to Ridwan. Ridwan, thanks so much for joining us today. As we know, governments across the African continent, across the world, as we heard in the introduction, and from Sienna's remarks too, have undertaken rapid data collection initiatives. Of course, this includes e-government services, SIM card registration that we've seen in a number of African countries as of late, as well as biometric voter registration. The list goes on and on. One of the big problems, and this is where you come in, this is where your expertise comes in, one of the significant problems here is that these initiatives are often done without sufficient, number one, data protection, and number two, sufficient oversight. So we were wondering if you could highlight some examples of existing gaps in laws and safeguards, and also based on your research, what have been the actual real life impacts of these existing gaps?
All right, thank you very much. I mean, So first, I'd like to say, just like you put out in the background, that there's a very big gap between, sorry, let me put it this way. Increasingly, in the last 2 decades, for example, you've seen increasing number of African governments who have allotted more money to, buy. You see a lot of funding going into purchase of surveillance tools, and of course, it's a global trend. But where it's scary and where the conversation is local, or where the program is local, is the fact that this is done in an environment where typically human rights issues are ignored, and there's typically lack of independent oversight mechanisms to check these things that are being done. But outside of that, you also question if, for example, are there relief for people when they've suffered any harm in the way of government-led surveillance or government-authorized surveillance. So, and to put this into perspective, some of the problems that you've seen so far is, first, pick up the trend. You see increasing number of mandatory SIM registration, which is being tied to security, even where the data on ground doesn't show how much of, how that has really kept people secure or how much of crime that has been able to solve. And it goes a step further, you now see the mandatory linkage of SIM cards and biometric identity system in the country, which of course then create a unique profile of people more accurately. But it doesn't stop at that. You also have issues with the easy or the simple way in which these tools could also filter into the government's hands. Now we talk about facial recognition technologies being embedded in CCTVs. We talk about location data being used increasingly. We talk about how encryption of communication is being lifted because somewhere in the law it's embedded in there. So some of the key problems, especially from the legal point of view, is first, we're seeing increasing government government increasingly widening the capability to legislate on enabling surveillance without safeguards. So you see laws, for example, in Nigeria, where without court authorization, for example, a direction to a telecommunication company, for example, can ask them to decrypt an encrypted communication. So we're seeing weakening and breaking of encryption on one hand. You're seeing introduction of new laws that is enabling and increasing government surveillance powers. You see state agencies as well who also have been enabled and emboldened to do these things. And of course, there is no requirement for transparency or for them to, give an account of what they are doing. Especially these records are not made available publicly. So but the key legal problems that we have here is, first, surveillance laws are scattered in different provisions of laws. So on one hand, you can have a law that creates a secret agency or law enforcement agency, for example, that give them surveillance powers. You have the law in the telecommunication sector, for example, also enabling law enforcement agencies, sometimes with the authorization of the court, sometimes without the authorization of the court, to compel telecommunication service providers or even financial service providers to turn over data. You have cloud policies, cloud documents saying, okay, you can actually access this for national security. So it's also hard to find the definition of legitimate aim in some country laws. In a research that we did, that we look at 6 African countries, Senegal, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Sudan. And these are some of the noticeable trends. So in some country laws, of course, you see the legitimate aim being clearly defined, but then you also see in practice, it's a different ballgame. Because for something as silly or as simple as a governor somewhere, for example, which is a case in Nigeria in 2015, decided to buy like a surveillance tool just to monitor political opponents. No authorization, no well-defined legitimate aim in that context. So you're also seeing absence of independent competence and competent judicial authority to look at some of this authorization. Of course, for emergency reasons, you can say, okay, surveillance may be necessary, maybe to prevent a bigger harm, to prevent terrorism. And those are like the legitimate things that you expect to see. But the typical thing is, even after doing that, even without authorization, you expect to come back to the court and the process is being reviewed. So this you don't see as a requirement. We don't have that periodic review by an oversight body. Oversight body even don't. In all of the countries that we looked at, it was only in South Africa that there was like a semblance of an oversight body. In every other country, this did not exist. Also, what are reasonable grounds? You see laws and you see vague definition, or words are used loosely, and it's really so hard to pin down to know what's really reasonable ground. Another thing is also how this extent of what can be requested for is not defined in scope. So law enforcement can just pull up, compel people to turn over or force them to do that. No scope, no limitations, and you have mass surveillance. But of course, increasingly, we're seeing so many of these things also go to the courts, where in South Africa, for example, you've seen the courts, give like an interesting judgment saying, mass surveillance can't possibly be the right thing. So you don't see also additional safeguards like in human rights impact assessment being conducted before these tools are deployed, data protection impact assessment being deployed before these tools are deployed, the role of transparency where these law enforcement agencies give an account of the number of requests that they are doing every year. Sometimes you never know you've been surveilled until maybe it becomes part of evidence before in a criminal trial. Also, the parts where due process can come in, people can have a room to appeal, and all of these safeguards that you typically expect. These are safeguards that you find even under the African Declaration. These are safeguards that you find under the necessity and proportionate principles, and also the UN draft principles on communication surveillance. So often or not, you find this missing in a lot of democracies. So, and these are some of the problems. But beyond what it's legal, again, one thing is having a provision, in a legal document. Another thing is the stark reality that is complete opposite of what's actually happening on ground. So these are some of the trends that we've noticed. These are some of the safeguards that are missing, and these are some of the problems, that even as a researcher, that we've had to contend with.
Thank you so much, Ridwan. I think one of the things that you mentioned that has been like a big thing for us as we reflected on the show is the idea that, governments use the law as the face of all of the things that they're doing. So for an ordinary citizen, for them, it's legal. We're expected to do this. So they freely then give that information. But then there is no control to say beyond that collection, where does that data go? How is that data used? To what extent is it not used for the wrong thing? And should it be used for that? Who is there to hold the government accountable? And then you also mentioned the idea of the technicality of the language that's often used in the law and the policy. I think it's just this vague nature of some of the provisions, but also then give power to the state or to governments. And in the absence of those that limit the power, it means that whatever data is collected, it can be used for whatever that they want to use it for. But I like that you gave us, some of the gaps in detail that exist, but we like to end the show on a positive note. So what I'm going to ask you is to also kind of just highlight some of the ways in which, it's civic activists, it's pro-democracy leaders from political parties, human rights defenders, researchers like yourself, and other people, what can be done, to just counter or to bridge those gaps that exist.
Of course, thanks. It's important that we all have a duty, and across all the stakeholders that you've mentioned, there's an important role they all have to play from education, because these things happen and we don't really have an idea, and we don't even understand the size. Sometimes it takes maybe Citizens Lab dropping a report for us to even get a sense, oh, this is actually happening, or maybe one of the big tech companies actually warning that, some sort of malicious spyware is actually it's being used in certain part of the world, for us to get a sense of what's truly happening. So we need more research. And that's for the research community from the civil society. We need more research, more evidence-driven research, where we can get a sense of, okay, how much is actually going into funding. Of course, you see it on the page of budgets, but then there are also extra budgetary allocations every year. We also need to know the extent of what are actually the vendors, and what are these tools being put to, what these tools really do represent. Then for people, for researchers, yes, of course, we need more research. For civil society, we need to advocate for more right respecting laws. We need to ask for this. Also, there's also a part where strategic litigation also play a role, where we ask the court to interpret, this is what the law says, this is what's really happening, has the law been complied with, and we challenge some of this, some of these actions, some of these things that have been done inappropriately without any legal backing. But then it doesn't just stop at that. Conversations like this are also very important to help people make sense of what's actually happening, and to get a sense of what can be done, what needs to be done. Well, like I said, from governments to civil society to the researchers to advocacy groups, there's a lot of work that we all need to do. First, raising awareness, but of course also challenging these abuses and misuse of privilege or power that the government we've seen used repeatedly.
Thank you very much, Ridwan, Placide, Sienna, for your contributions. This has been such a rich and insightful discussion, and I hope our viewers are getting as much out of it as I certainly have. But with that said, we are now going to turn the stage over to my colleague Nick Cheeseman and today's discussant, who has waited very patiently, Albert Shara, to get their respective reactions to the show thus far. And we might also be bringing in Julie Owono, who might be joining us in a few minutes. So Nick will be curating the questions that came through our WhatsApp and on our social media pages. And of course, talking about the broader themes we've been attempting to unpack today. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff, and a great discussion, everyone, so far. Just a heads up for our speakers, I'll be putting the questions that are coming in over WhatsApp into the chat. So if you check out the chat, you can get a head start on thinking about answering the question that's coming in for you. But before that, we're really lucky to have Albert here today, already been introduced by the team. But it's worth saying that one of the things that all of the speakers, of course, identified is that we need new, serious, in-depth research on these topics. And Albert is doing that, doing a doctorate, and in particular looking at Southern Africa and some of the themes here, how they play out there, and also around protests. So Albert, it's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce you and welcome you to the Resistance Bureau. This is your first time, so welcome. We hope it'll be the first of many. And to start with, I'm just going to pass the floor over to you. Please give us your reflections on what you've heard so far. Tell us what your own research, says to this agenda, and then I'll start giving the questions back to the panelists. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. So yeah, so it's been interesting, and I'm happy to share my experience and also to comment on what the speakers have said. So surveillance now is taking like a very critical and also going deeper than we all expected. So when I was trying to do my PhD, I ended up developing a chapter which is looking at how surveillance is transforming. So surveillance has been around, but now the route that it is taking now in this digital age is now what is making us all concerned. So it all centers around the idea of state control, in which the government want to be in control of everyone, citizens, and also those who are promoting dissent. And so what is becoming so popular from the African perspective, from my research, is that although mass surveillance is something that the government is concerned with, but now they are promoting what we are calling targeted surveillance. And this one, if you look at regions like Southern Africa, where it has been the activists, the political activists that have been causing headache to the authorities, you see now that they have gone deeper. And Placide, I think, gave like very practical examples, like from my own experiences, to talk to some activists who shared stories like, you are just drinking, you are just enjoying time with friends, and then you just receive a text message. Of course, maybe Placide's text was just warning him, but now in this case, most of the activists that they really get a text that has got private and sensitive information. They tell you your bank accounts, where you are holding that bank account, who has been sending money to your account, and also where do your students, also your children, also go for school, the kind of car that you drive, and the places that you go to for maybe for drinking, and so forth. So in most cases, when you get that information, it exposes you. And now it has become so sophisticated with the digital identity program, because now in most countries now the SIM card and the national ID, they are all integrated. So with just a press of a button now, the government has got access to all information that belongs to you. And it is making it so difficult. And so what is so happening now with the whole structure of surveillance now, especially in Africa, is that now it still follows now the traditional system of regulating the dissent online. So there are what we are calling the gates. So at first time, if you're just starting making noise, now they mark you. And when they mark you now, that's when they start now to look for your information now for them to practice targeted surveillance. And now it is also getting worse. So when Sienna was presenting, she mentioned, I think, the three hierarchies, the three generations. So when you look at those, you also see how they are reflecting across the African region. And now it has gotten deeper by the decision by governments. Like if you go to Malawi, you go to Zimbabwe, you find that the government, the police system now have even created a cybersecurity unit. And such units now, they are responsible for monitoring the online space. and they're quick at capturing that information and send it to the people who are responsible for dealing with you. And when you go beyond that, what we have seen that now people are now being arrested for posting in a WhatsApp group. And that's how serious now surveillance has gone to. So you are just enjoying in a group with friends, and then someone picks up that conversation, and then it's sent to the authorities, and they come after you. And now when you look at all that, you realize that you're no longer safe. And it's so interesting now when you talk to people who have been in ICT. Like during my visit to Zambia, I had an opportunity to talk to the director of ICT. Yes, about so you have to tell me that whatever is happening now is something that these people have been observing and also expecting to happen now. But now it seems like maybe our response has been so slow, especially from the victim side. We have also seen stories that have been coming from South Africa, especially last week, in which some activists were willing to say, we know that there is mass surveillance that is digital in that sense, and we are trying to do ABCD. So that response has been so slow, and it's not properly coordinated, and I agree to the presenters. So we really need to step up. The civil society, they really need to step up. The opposition political parties, they really need to step up their digital skills, particularly on what tools to use and also what not to use. It has been easier for some of the people to have at least maybe 2 SIM cards, but now the moment the SIM card registration started, now it's difficult now for you to have even 2 SIM cards and claim to say, I'm safe with this one. And according to some of the directors within the government ICT sector, they're also saying now the future is now still not promising, because now shortly it will be like what you see on Twitter or on Facebook. If you see my username, you will be seeing the real person. There will be no chance for you to use pseudonyms. So the moment that link is made, in which real people are online and the real people online, that the real people offline, then it will be more scary, because you cannot post anything, because you know that they know it's you. So that's now how difficult it is coming now. But now I also feel like if you listen like to the number of issues that were raised by Ridwan, you see that while we have got that scary environment, there's still some space in which we can play around and advocate against particular laws, and also to maybe helping our governments not to procure particular facilities or tools from some countries. Like you see in Africa, it's now the desperation of state control, as I said, in which some countries now not going as long as, just going as far as getting free infrastructure just for surveillance. Like Zimbabwean government, when Mugabe was in power, they had to receive a donation from Iran. And most of the countries are still getting donations, others from China, from North Korea, and they're just desperate for them to control. But then for us, we come in and then we make noise a bit, and then we get silent. We get the silence. For instance, in Malawi, I think in 2011, the government had procured an infrastructure that allows the institution to intervene. They can intercept communication, and they can see all the conversation that you are having. And there was noise just a bit, and then it goes off. So there's also need for us to put in pressure, and that pressure should be consistent. It should not just be making noise just for a shorter period of time and off it goes. It has to be consistent, and also we need to be putting that pressure, working together with international partners, so that it makes sense. Because when the pressure is put from the local perspective or on the ground at national level, if it corresponds with the pressure that we are putting on the international level, the two will go together well. What we need to understand now is that the government, they are not sleeping. They are trying to put they're just trying to turn every stone that is in their way for them to control any decent voice. A very good example is that in 2020 in Zambia, the youth announced a protest. And when they announced the protest, the government was taking advantage of COVID and said, no one should protest. And as early as 6 a.m., all the streets were congested by the security officers. And the youth, they had to innovate, and they announced on their page to say, don't go on the streets, just follow our page. And these youths, they went into the bush and streamed live the movement from there. 3 weeks later, we saw the government bowing down to the pressure. So you would see that those people who are trying to fight for the rights of people, they are becoming very innovative. But actually, we need to balance that with proper pressure that should go towards stopping governments from procuring some of these tools that are so repressive. And also the same should correspond with the laws that the country also subscribed to, like particularly the international laws. If we balance that equation, then we'll be able to slow down the government, although it is still scary and the future is not actually promising as of now. So I would stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Albert. Really good points. Before we go back to our speakers, I've got an individual question for each of you from the great WhatsApp audience, home audience, watching us all over Africa and all over the world. But I wanted to ask everyone also, when we come back to you, to give one tip to the activists and the researchers who are watching about how they can avoid surveillance, right? Let's make it really practical. So, I tell any student I have that when they're in the field, for example, they should never put the name of an individual they're interviewing on the notes, right? Put a number on the notes, create a log on a completely different platform, which can correspond the numbers to the name of the individual, so that you can put together the transcripts and the names. But whoever steals your laptop or hacks your laptop can't put together the names of the interview with the transcript of the interview. That's protecting your informants, right, and your research participants. So for example, what would be the one tip you would give a researcher or an activist? We know there are hundreds of them watching right now, just to help them stay a little bit safer when they're doing their research, both to stop being surveilled, but also, given that they're likely at some point to be surveilled, helping them to make sure that they protect their information and the people that participate with them when they are. Now, we have 3 questions. I'm going to push that one back to you as well, Albert, at the end. So you're going to come back and give us one there. We've got 3 questions in the chat. So question for Sienna, I'm going to read them all out and then come to you one at a time in the order in which you spoke. Sienna, there's always been surveillance, asks one of our audience members. There's always been repression. What is the real difference between digital and analog authoritarianism? So perhaps a sort of suggestion here that we're exaggerating the distinction between a kind of what was happening traditionally and what might be happening in the modern world, and a question about what's really the difference between the two. Second question here, I proceed. What are the most effective ways to outmaneuver the surveillance? Given that you're somebody who's likely to be surveilled and tracked again in the future, what are you doing? Are you using Signal rather than WhatsApp? Are you not using the platforms at all? Are you using code words to refer to people? You talked about, your concern that the way that you used information in the past could potentially have put your colleagues in jeopardy. What are you doing about that now? And then finally, question for Widvan, which really picks up on what Albert said at the end of his piece. So there's a nice segue there, which is, where have we seen positive cases of citizens and civil society groups holding governments to account? Has the judiciary stood up to be counted in any countries that we could point to? What lessons can we learn from success stories over the last 10 years? And I should say, I think all of these questions are very applicable beyond Africa, right? So although we have mainly African speakers today, feel free to bring in positive examples from beyond the continent that we can learn from as we move forwards. So going to you first, Sienna, and then to you, Pasi, then to you, Ridwan, and then I'll come to you, Albert, very quickly for that point at the end. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I think we might be, or at least I'm unintentionally exaggerating the distinction between digital repression and political repression, because the panel's on digital repression. But I think it's a good point to make. And just to clarify, at least from where I stand, digital repression is an extension and a broadening of opportunities to undertake political repression. So I wouldn't sort of think of them as 2 completely separate things. But I do think there are some unique points to digital repression that make it worth sort of a greater scrutiny. And I think Albert made some excellent points in his few minutes there, so I would sort of just build on that. But I think digital repression can be undertaken at a larger scale than, let's say, in-person or physical forms of political repression, likely at a lower cost as well, and I think is highly adaptable. There are so many different ways that one can undertake digital repression. further political oppression. So I think those 3 points are worth mentioning. In terms of the question about Nick, your question earlier, a practical tool, the Citizen Lab helped develop something called the Security Planner. Perhaps someone can drop a link in the relevant channel that can help you sort of think through digital security. But beyond that, I think it was a good point that you made, Nick, that you should always have a plan before you go in the field in terms of how you're going to protect your privacy and how you're going to protect other people's privacy. And no plan is going to be perfect, of course. You cannot assure your privacy or others at 100%, but I think making sure that you've thought through the risks, thought through those steps, and in many cases made those you're going to work with aware of the risks is an important way of approaching this.
Great, thank you very much. And proceed over to you about the ways that you've sought to outmaneuver surveillance.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one. I should start by the principle. The very effective way to avoid surveillance is democracy in our countries. That is the only one solution. Otherwise, it's, I have been managing 3 or 4 cell phones, smartphones, but it is not, it doesn't work. It just complicates your life. So you don't have to do such things. We have seriously to struggle for democracy, for freedom in our countries, so that control is not put to the population, but to the state, to the power. We have to control the power. The people who are governing our countries, they have to be controlled so that they cannot abuse our rights. But for some practical tips, maybe it's important for some cases to pay attention and to have some solutions. For example, when you plan to travel, it's very important that your usual phone or smartphone, you don't use it. You don't travel with it. We take another one. Preferably without WhatsApp and signals. Signal is said to be safer than WhatsApp, but the thing is, WhatsApp discovered that it was vulnerable, but Signal, we don't know, is it or not? So it's not. We are not sure that it's safe. So for some cases, you should avoid smartphones. That is very important for your security. And for others, you should use physical contact without any networks, be it via your smartphone or your laptops. It's the same. When you are on networks, you can be inspired. It's easy for those criminals to monitor us. An example that I would like to share is how they kidnapped a famous person in Rwanda, Paul Rusesabagina, in Dubai. They surely used his phone. They monitored his phones during his travel, and then they take him to Rwanda without him knowing that he is going to Rwanda. It's an example that we should pay attention. When I say that democracy is the only one solution, is the only one solution, sustainable solution. But for our personal security, we really have to pay attention with those governments because they are criminals. They will not hesitate to kill us. So please don't take your smartphone in your trip if you think that your work is a danger for criminals. So that is my advice. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I love that we're getting real practical advice now for those watching, which is great. Ridwan, over to you. So the question here was about whether or not you and your research and your team have seen any positive examples, either in Africa or beyond, about citizens and civil society groups holding governments to account, and your sort of top practical tip for our viewers. Over to you.
Okay, so I mean, we've seen an increasing number of strategic litigation coming up in different parts of the world, more importantly in Africa, as you have it. In Nigeria, this year, at least I'm aware of about not less than 2-3 cases directly challenging government surveillance power, either asking the court to interpret some provisions of the law or directly challenging executive decision. Another thing we've seen in South Africa, for example, where the law enabling surveillance, for example, the court has also ruled specifically on it, and that some fraction of it is enabling mass surveillance. So, and across different countries, you're seeing increasing number of these kind of strategic litigations, where people are asking questions, using the courts to ask questions, to ask the government to be more transparent with what they're doing. Another interesting thing you've also seen is research that has taken a deep dive into budgetary allocation or budgetary spending year in, year out, every fiscal year for governments, just trying to track the spending on surveillance. But outside of this, you've also seen advocacy groups who have been very vocal about their request. In Nigeria, for example, there's a judgment against the government, specifically on the Cyber Crimes Act. When there are laws like this going through the legislative cycle, you see people who are asking questions, drawing attention to laws that are not right respecting in the sense. But you'll also see a case where we're getting more research that is more data-driven come out, which is then being able to highlight to us to also see the extent of what the problem really is. So for me, that's a big progress from what you've had in the last 10 years where even for civil society, it wasn't like top burner issue. So that's progress for me. Even though we're not there yet, and I see so much that needs to be tried and so much that needs to be done. But the key thing for us to take here in terms of what possible lessons we could learn from here is that, yes, we should ask questions. We should challenge these things in courts. Whether the courts decide to take side with the government, and in the words of Placid, with the criminals, like you said, whether the government decide, whether the court choose to take side with them or choose to safeguard human rights, which is part of the primary function that they have, it's a different ballgame. But first, let's ask those questions and let's push it over to the court to make that decision, whether these things are right or whether they are wrong.
Thanks so much. So a couple quick thoughts for me on other ways, little tips for people to keep themselves and their data safe. I see Judy's joined us, which is great. I'll give her a moment to catch her breath from our previous meeting, and then we'll go back to Jeff and Mantade to have a chat with her. But two final thoughts for me. Very simple, right? I think a lot of people don't make it as hard as they could for people to do the simple kinds of hacking, right? So I know a lot of people doing reasonably sensitive work who are not using two-factor authentication on their emails, which is basically a system that if you go to Google account, you can set it up automatically, get an app on your phone. If there's ever a sign in from a new device, you need to be able to put in the number that's on the authenticator app on your phone to be able to open your email. Just makes it a little bit harder for people to hack into your email, right? There's so many systems out there that you can do just to make it a little bit harder. They're not going to protect you from really focused attempts to hack into your accounts, but they are going to make it a little bit difficult for people who aren't as good and aren't experienced, don't have as good technology. Another obvious one, right? We know that sometimes people can listen in even if your mobile phone is turned off. So don't just turn your mobile phone off if you're in a sensitive meeting. Leave the mobile phone in another room, put it in a box, have the meeting in a room with no mobile phones in. Little things, right? That can just give you a little bit of added protection when you're doing dangerous or sensitive work out there, if you're an activist or a researcher who's operating in a really tough context. Okay, great to see you, Judy. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to pass back to Jeff and Mantade. And then Albert, we haven't forgot you. We'll come back to you for the final word in a moment.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Nick. And Julie, thanks so much for joining us and being able to spend some time with us as we close out this show. So I wanted to bring you in really quickly before we do conclude, because we've been talking a lot in the latter half of the conversation about how more and more countries in Africa and elsewhere are legalizing state surveillance under the pretext of a number of things: fighting cybercrime, maintaining national security, fighting terrorism, ensuring public order. But we've seen, that these laws often lack transparency and accountability mechanisms, something that Ridwan spoke very eloquently about. There really seems to be a lack of independent oversight. So we wanted to ask you really quickly, could you speak a bit more on this weaponization of the law to entrench digital authoritarianism? And is this a new phenomenon? And how do you see this progressing in the years to come?
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you all. First of all, I would like to sincerely apologize for my absence earlier in the show. It was with a huge regret that I had to balance two very urgent commitments, which was this one and another one. And but I'm glad I still could make this not final remarks, but share with you some of these thoughts. So on your question, Jeffrey, about the weaponization of surveillance laws or digital authoritarianism laws in general, I would say, first of all, we have to remember the phenomenons and the context of these laws. The first one, which is extremely important, and I think the participants in this conversation, and also the Resistance Bureau in general, is very cognizant of this, the fact that internationally there has been a push towards an emergency to fight terrorism at all costs, including at the cost of freedoms and democracy. We've seen that even in very stable democracies where laws have permitted very intrusive surveillance mechanisms with the aim of balancing security and fighting terror attacks and terrorism networks. While this aim is absolutely understandable, I am in no way saying here that we should not fight terrorism. Of course we should, we must, but we should never do this at the expense of rule of law and democracy. And unfortunately, we have seen in the past 10 years that many of our democracies have given up on many of the rule of law principles that should apply to privacy, to fairness, and to due process, and so many other very important principles. Well, this general resignation on some of rule of law principles in the name of fighting terrorism have given justification and passes to some extent to other governments in more repressive environments, saying, okay, we are allowed to do this because there is a general worldwide fight against terrorism, and terrorism is even more dangerous for our countries and societies. So we therefore need to fight against it. Again, while the aim is absolutely understandable, the weaponization of that fight that we have seen in the past 10 years, which has extremely focused on not on terrorists only, but I would say in some cases, mainly even as focused on opposition members, on activists, journalists, well, that aim is particularly worrying, and that trend is particularly worrying. The second context that we have to remember here is that this surveillance does not happen. Governments, especially governments in Africa, do not have the means, technical means, to pursue and to enact surveillance on digital platforms and infrastructures. For that, they do need to work with telecommunications companies, many of them which own the digital infrastructure that provides internet connectivity in many of the countries in Africa. That doesn't mean that those telecommunications companies and other private companies agree with being, accessories of human rights violation and particularly of privacy. But the result remains that they have sometimes to obey those very problematic laws. That is why it's extremely important, and I wanted to insist on that here, it's extremely important to remind that the fight against digital authoritarianism is not only for activists to take the lead on, but really needs allyship from private companies whose interest is not to have societies where rights are suppressed or limited, but whose interest is really to have societies where openness, freedoms are the principles of internet interactions and connectivity. And that is why there are organizations and networks around the world that help companies respond to those legal, but sometimes very illegal orders to provide surveillance apparatus to governments. And I'm thinking specifically about groups such as the Global Network Initiative, which welcomes members from private companies, telecommunications operators, to social media platforms and many others. And also civil society organizations. And then Authoritarianism is member of the Global Network Initiatives, but many others, including Human Rights Watch, I think, and many others. And also academics who are together to think through how to better respond to orders to violate freedom of expression and privacy. And the GNI has developed a set of guidance for companies when they receive such orders, how they should respond, what legal compliance mechanism they should have internally, and so many other processes that would ensure that the violation of freedom of expression remains the last resort possible in any situation. And last but not least, everyone has to chime in, of course, not only activists, not only companies, but also governments from democratic nations. And I'm thinking, of course, especially here about countries from the European Union and the United States, who have to condemn whenever such violations happen, those states have to condemn state surveillance that's practiced disproportionately and unnecessary, and that unnecessarily affects activists and human rights defenders around the world, and particularly in Africa. This is what I could say on your question, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much. And just really quickly, in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I wanted to get to a topic that we haven't discussed here today, and I know you're an expert on this, so I wanted to ask you while we have you. Of course, as we head into next year, right, there are many important elections coming up across Africa, including, as you know, in countries that have a history of shutting down the internet during tense political moments, including on election day. This, of course, includes Madagascar, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and DR Congo, to name just a few. And we've been talking a lot about solutions today, not just admiring the problem, but what people can do to actively fight back against these transgressions that we are seeing increasingly happen. So I wanted to ask you, what can activists and even ordinary citizens in these countries and others do to potentially ward off an internet shutdown in their country around elections? And how can they make sure that they stay connected when and if that ultimately happens? So some technical guidance for those who might be listening today.
Yes, thank you very much for asking this very important and timely question. Probably the first advice that I would give now is to watch very closely what's happening in Iran right now. Right now, there is an internet shutdown, and also a specific blocking of social media platforms. It's very, very encouraging to see how organizations, activists there are organizing themselves to ensure that despite the blackout, the information on the repression still goes out. That means partnering with news organizations, calling attention as much as possible beyond African networks, if that were in an African context, but here it was Iran, it is Iran, calling attention beyond the Iranian context and networks, using diaspora. We tend to forget that we have very powerful African diaspora that continues to have access to internet and to connectivity when there is a blackout. It's important to build up those alliances and to be able to rely on the diasporic public to make sure that the message around violations and electoral, rigging is still being put out in the world. What is important to remember is that when we talk about internet shutdowns, we talk about two phenomena which call two different types of solutions. So a complete blackout where there is no telecommunications or no internet telecommunications, in which, of course, external help will be extremely necessary, and external networks will be very necessary. And the second types of shutdowns are specific blocking of specific websites, usually social media platforms. In that second instance, it's very helpful to have at disposal either a circumvention browser such as Tor, which is famously known, which allows you to have another IP address that's not related to the country where you are, and that allows you to continue be able using those websites, or using VPNs, bearing in mind that VPNs are extremely some of them, especially the free ones, are privacy violating most of the time and consume a lot of data. So it's important also for human rights organizations to try to partner with VPN organizations so that those can give credit. We've done that with some organizations in Chad, for instance. Internet Sans Frontières has done that with Chad in the past. So yes, it's important to have in mind those two different types of shutdown in order to be able to develop two different set of responses. But all in all, the key word is preparation. We know networks shutdown will happen, so we must be prepared. And that takes more than 2-3 weeks. It takes sometimes months to be able to have a very robust infrastructure in place.
Thank you so much, Julie. Preparation and solidarity. I think you make two very, very important points. And we promised, Nick, to go back to you and to Albert before we close out today's show with Mentade. So Nick, back over to you to help us run down the show.
Great, thanks, Julian. I thought those are really good comments, both in terms of, the problem that you can use a VPN, but if you use a poor quality one, your data can still go. And that highlights the fact we have so many African countries that don't have data privacy laws that enable people to protect citizens online. So that's a big fight, I think, over the next 20 years. And then your point about, internet shutdowns, which is another great point. And of course, really reminds us that if you're an election observation group or your domestic monitors, you need to be building systems that can operate if they bring down WhatsApp and social media, right? And so one of the things I think we've seen a lot of organizations do in the last few years is develop a kind of hard copy backup that even if the internet is brought down, even if key services are brought down, that doesn't mean you don't actually collect the data. It just means it might take a little bit longer. I think we saw that, someone like Zambia, the last election. I'm sure in the elections coming up, we'll start to see observers and monitors developing these kind of offline plans in case the worst happens. But Albert, we promised you the last word. You've been very patient again. So please feel free to reflect on what you've heard. And also, of course, I wanted to come to you for your top tip on, keeping data and information private in the age of digital authoritarianism.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. And so I would say all the speakers that have given out actually good tips that are a good starting point. So I think what I would say also is lacking, or what need to be promoted is like unity among all the affected players. So it's not just a game for human rights activists. The media as well, they're so critical in all this advocacy. And also there's need to creating a committee that should affect the way the civil society work. So the problem has been like civil societies within a particular country, they advocate for different ideologies and then they work independently. That does not help. These different, if you've got different interests, but still if you are within the civil society community and the opposition, you really need to work together. And when you work together, then you'll be able to hold the government accountable. And also, apart from all the tactics that you might have, it is so important that we put ahead, like in front, making sure that the government doesn't make a step before we make a step. So it has to start with us. Every step that the government makes, the civil society and the media, they need to be there, well informed. You have to have that information ahead of the government. And then there's need also to promote ICT skills among those people who are who are working within the civic space, just to make sure that at least you are up by the game, because it's not just about having a smartphone. You need to know how to use it, avoid the conduct or the behavior of just having same password for all the emails that you have and so forth. So we really need to make sure that maybe there are structures, those people who are leading the civil society organizations in different countries, make sure that at least you organize trainings so that the people understand, particularly those activists, they understand how to use the digital skills. There's also another tactic of avoiding all this, just making sure that you are closer to the diaspora community. I think Julie mentioned that, and also working with the UN. So within the UN, particularly the Human Rights Council, there's an initiative called the Universal Periodic Review. They are really doing a good job in trying to protect the human rights within Africa. So we really need to work with them. We should not be in isolation. So whenever things are happening, those people, they should be available to provide support. Julie mentioned about preparedness, and then that preparedness work, if you have got also support, and not support that's just within your own country. So that's what I would say. Let's gain those skills and know how to use the ICT infrastructure, and so that you know you are being followed. It's easy to know that you are being followed. I think there's a toolkit which I can share with you later on, or that activists can use or anyone can use just to avoid being government conducting surveillance on you. So that's one of the major tips that I would share with our viewers and everyone here. Thank you.
Thanks, Albert. Brilliant comments. And one of the things we can do is if all the other panelists share with us the information and links that they've talked about today, we can get out over Twitter and Facebook to make sure that all of the people watching get access to that. So everybody who's watching today will be sharing that tonight, tomorrow. Please follow the Twitter and Facebook page so that you can do that and access those links. And we're now at the end of the show. So thanks to our brilliant panelists. I'm going to throw it back to Mantadi and Jeff to close.
Thank you so much, Nick. Would have loved to keep this conversation going because it's very informative, but time doesn't allow us. So we have to bring the show to a close. A special shout out to our panel of experts. You did a very good job. Our team at the Resistance Bureau we're always looking forward to keeping in touch with all of the speakers and the panelists that we have, and also just highlighting some of the work that you do moving forward. You truly inspire each of us. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And of course, thank you to our audience for engaging with us and for tuning in. Please stay in touch with us between shows by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing on our homepage to get updates on the program, as well as show summaries and participant videos. On our website, you can also revisit past shows, all of which are saved in the episode section. You can also search for us on Apple Podcasts to download our shows there so you can listen anytime. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So please definitely follow us so you stay in touch with what we're doing, what we're planning. As a final note, the continued impact of this program is a real testament to the efforts of our entire Resistance Bureau team. A big thank you as always to our tech manager, Peter Dory, and to our creative director, Ndondom Saga, who work behind the scenes to make the Resistance Bureau a success. Thank you again for joining us today. We appreciate you all. Stay safe in the meantime, keep fighting the good fight, and see you next time. Goodbye.